In 1900, 95% of Europeans identified as Christians. Today, that number is falling fast, and even those who claim it barely practice it. Churches are closing. Cathedrals are being turned into cafes. Europe has rejected the faith it once exported to the world. And here's why that could become the greatest cultural mistake in Western history. Before we start, know this: the world is shifting, fast, not just through war, but through money, media, and memory. This channel exists for one reason: to expose what headlines won't. The power plays behind diplomacy, the real motives behind economic deals, the quiet moves that shape your future before you even notice. This isn't about fear, it's about clarity. Because when you see the pattern, you stop reacting, you start preparing. So stay with us, because what's happening now in Europe isn't just about religion or politics. It's about identity, collapse, and what could come next. Not every empire dies in flames. Some fade when they forget what once gave them meaning. In Europe's heart, where church bells once ruled the day, there's now silence. The continent that once exported Christianity to the world now watches its pews empty and its faith dissolve. On paper, over 70% of Europeans still call themselves Christians. But look closer. In Sweden, barely 1 in 5 teens gets confirmed. In Germany, 500,000 people left the Catholic Church in just 1 year. In France, the non-religious now outnumber Catholics. This isn't just about empty churches. It's about empty meaning. Weddings, funerals, Christmas concerts, the rituals remain. But the belief? Hollowed out. Faith has become heritage. Identity without conviction. Some call it progress. Others see a deeper crisis. A continent drifting, no longer rooted in the values that once shaped its laws, its art, its identity. And here's the twist. Most people missed the moment it all began. It wasn't the 20th century, not the Enlightenment. It started earlier, with a quiet split between the sacred and the state. A split that promised freedom, but may have triggered something far more dangerous: forgetting. Let's go back to that moment. To understand Europe's spiritual erosion, we must return to a time when Christianity wasn't just belief. It was law, identity, and civilization. That foundation began to crack in the 16th century, not with open rebellion, but with a reformer's pen. Martin Luther didn't seek to destroy the church. He sought to purify it. But in doing so, he altered its role forever. The Protestant Reformation fractured the theological monopoly of Rome. It democratized access to the sacred, but also diluted the authority of institutional faith. Luther's doctrine of vocation, his claim that every honest profession could be holy, seemed liberating. But it quietly displaced the church as the spiritual center of life. Monks once withdrew from the world to find God. Now, it was argued, you could serve God by managing a bakery. That subtle shift sanctified the secular. Yet, something deeper was changing. Reformers like Calvin argued that kings and princes did not need the church's blessing to rule. Political authority was no longer beneath the cross, it stood beside it. This would become the theological seed of the modern nation-state, where law and governance began to untangle from theology. But there's something most people miss here. Because while it looked like spiritual revival, it was in fact the beginning of institutional retreat. We'll return to this. As Europe split between Protestant and Catholic camps, the old idea of Christendom, one faith, one empire, began to fade. That fragmentation turned violent. The 30 Years' War, which began in 1618, wasn't just a power struggle. It was a brutal verdict on religion's role in society. Entire cities were razed. Famine and plague followed armies like shadows. 8 million people died. And amid the ruins, one idea hardened in the minds of rulers. Perhaps faith was too dangerous to be trusted with power. The war didn't just devastate landscapes, it shattered illusions. In its wake, a new vision emerged, one where the state would ensure peace not through divine sanction, but through secular control. And that decision would echo across centuries. After the fires of religious war cooled, Europe entered a new phase, not of peace, but of disillusionment. The Enlightenment didn't arrive with armies or declarations. It crept in through books, salons, and academies. For the first time, reason stood as judge over revelation. Philosophers began to argue that ethics could exist without God, that truth could be observed, not received. And slowly, the sacred was replaced by the rationale. This wasn't just intellectual, it was structural. In the past, the Church had defined the moral boundaries of society. Now, those boundaries were redrawn by thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Kant. God became optional. Scripture became literature. And in many circles, belief became something to hide, not something to proclaim. But there's a detail buried here, one that most overlook, because as science and philosophy rose, something else began to fall. The Church's monopoly on meaning. We'll come back to that. Then came the Industrial Revolution. Cities exploded in size, but imploded in cohesion. People abandoned the village church for the factory clock. In rural life, the church was more than a place of worship. It was a calendar, a community, a court. In the cities, it became background noise. The sacred rhythms of life were replaced by mechanical time, economic pressure, and social fragmentation. And amid that chaos, the spiritual center collapsed without ceremony. Public education played its role too. As literacy expanded, state-run schools began to eclipse religious instruction. What had once been learned from the pulpit was now debated in classrooms. Students encountered Darwin, Newton, and Marx, not Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And the more they read, the more distant the church seemed, not just physically, but epistemologically. This was the moment when faith began to drift into the margins, not by attack, but by substitution. The modern world didn't need to persecute religion. It only needed to ignore it. And in that silence, belief slowly atrophied. But not entirely. Because just as Europe's confidence in reason reached its height, the 20th century delivered a shock that logic couldn't explain. We'll return to that turning point shortly. The 20th century should have been the triumph of reason. Instead, it was a descent into mechanized horror. 2 world wars, conceived in the most educated, industrialized corner of the planet, left Europe in ruins. The so-called Christian continent had unleashed destruction on a scale that no theology could justify. And in that rubble, many began asking the unspoken question: if this is what civilization leads to, where was God? The answer didn't come from pulpits. In many places, the churches stood silent, or complicit. Whether in their failure to resist fascism or their uneasy proximity to nationalist regimes, institutional Christianity struggled to speak with moral clarity. Worse still, it had often sanctified empire. For centuries, European colonialism had carried the cross alongside the flag. Christian missions were not just spiritual endeavors. They became tools of cultural conquest. And when the empires fell, the faith that had accompanied them was stained by association. But here's the part we rarely hear. What Europeans began to reject wasn't just religion. It was the memory of using belief as a weapon. As the continent confronted its imperial past, younger generations recoiled not from God, but from the institutions that had remained silent through genocide, occupation, and dehumanization. And this created a new kind of secularism, not cold or intellectual, but emotional. A rejection born of shame. By the late 20th century, a shift had taken hold. Christianity in Europe became a relic, something observed at weddings or funerals, but not trusted to guide moral action. And yet, there was still something deeper unfolding. Because just as the West abandoned religion in pursuit of peace, it also created a moral vacuum, one that politics, ideology, and consumerism rushed to fill. But none of them, even at their peak, could offer what faith once promised: transcendence, purpose, forgiveness. And that brings us to the modern dilemma. If Europe no longer believes in the Church, what does it believe in? The answer isn't as clear as we'd like to think, and some signs suggest that this void is beginning to echo. But that's something we need to examine through the lens of what happened after the wars, when the decline turned from cultural to structural. We'll explore that next. By the time the bombs stopped falling and the treaties were signed, Europe was exhausted, physically, morally, and spiritually. The post-war period did not bring religious revival. Instead, it accelerated a quiet detachment. For many, God had failed to intervene when it mattered most. And if he had been silent in Auschwitz, in Dresden, in Nanking, then what role could he possibly play in the bureaucracies and suburbs that followed? In the West, Reconstruction meant modernization, and modernization brought secularism. France codified it, Germany normalized it, Scandinavia embraced it. The term laïcité in France didn't simply mean neutrality. It was a deliberate exclusion of religion from public life. Schools, courts, hospitals, even cemeteries were restructured under a vision of the state as morally self-sufficient. The Church was no longer a partner in governance. It was an artifact to be managed. But this wasn't just policy, it was personal. Generations born after the war came of age in a world of rising affluence, expanding education, and consumer choice. Church attendance was no longer social obligation. It was optional. And as with any optional tradition, each generation participated a little less. In Italy, civil weddings began to outnumber church ceremonies. In Spain, religious baptisms declined sharply after the fall of Franco. By the 1990s, in many European cities, being Christian meant little more than celebrating Christmas with family. And even that was starting to fade. And yet, there's a strange twist in this story. Because while Western Europe was shedding its religious skin, the East was quietly holding on. In Russia, Serbia, Romania, countries where religion had been violently suppressed for decades, Christianity re-emerged after the Cold War not as a burden, but as a badge of survival. It was not just about faith. It was about identity reclaimed. Why the reversal? Why did the parts of Europe that tried to erase God become the ones to guard his memory? We'll return to that question because the answer reveals something critical about belief in times of crisis. For now, it's enough to see that by the end of the 20th century, the decline of Christianity in Europe wasn't just underway. It had become the default. But a culture doesn't forget its faith all at once. It forgets in layers, in rituals that lose their meaning, in generations that no longer ask, in silence where there used to be song. And behind that silence, something else was beginning to take shape. A new relationship with religion, not as truth, but as symbolism. And this symbolic faith, hollowed out from within, would soon face its deepest test. As the 21st century unfolded, the Church in Europe faced a crisis not of belief, but of credibility. After decades of silence and distance, scandals emerged that stripped away any remaining moral high ground. The revelations were staggering: thousands of abuse cases, decades of cover-ups, and an institution more committed to protecting itself than the vulnerable. In Germany alone, over 500,000 people formally left the Catholic Church in 2022. In the Netherlands, churches closed at such a rate that the government warned of an impending architectural void. But these were not isolated statistics. They were symptoms of a deeper emotional rupture. What many Europeans began to feel was not hatred toward Christianity, but indifference, a quiet disaffection. Faith no longer offered guidance or refuge. It became just another voice in a crowded room, competing with media, ideology, and consumer culture. Churches still stood at the center of cities, but few entered them. Crosses remained on flags, but no longer meant sacrifice. In this vacuum, both traditionalists and progressives blamed each other for the decline. Some said the church had become too liberal, too willing to accommodate modern values. Others claimed it was too rigid, too exclusive to survive in a pluralistic world. But neither side addressed the core issue: relevance. In a society driven by speed, choice, and spectacle, the church began to feel slow, opaque, and irrelevant. And while many still identified as Christian, culturally or ancestrally, this identification was largely passive. Rituals persisted without belief. Baptisms, weddings, holidays, they were kept out of habit, not conviction. Christianity had become for many not a compass, but a costume. Yet beneath this surface of decay, something more subtle was unfolding. Because when a civilization disconnects from its metaphysical roots, it doesn't float freely. It searches for substitutes. And in place of religious doctrine, new belief systems began to rise: political ideologies, social movements, environmental moralism, technological utopianism. Each promised a kind of salvation, each demanded loyalty, but none offered transcendence. And here lies the paradox. In trying to move beyond religion, Europe did not become neutral. It became fragmented. Each group claimed its own sacred values, but no shared moral language remained. And without that shared language, consensus became harder, division sharper. But there's something else we haven't touched yet, something that might determine whether Christianity fades into memory or returns in another form. Let's look ahead. What remains of Christianity in Europe today is more shadow than structure. It still exists, on paper, in architecture, in tradition. But its authority is hollow. For many, it has become a backdrop to life, not a guide. Even in countries where the majority still identify as Christian, regular participation in religious practice has collapsed. The rituals continue, but the belief that once animated them has faded into abstraction. And yet, this isn't the end of the story. Across the continent, pockets of resistance persist, not only among the devout, but also in cultural memory. Christmas markets, cathedral weddings, Easter processions, these continue not because people believe, but because they remember. But there's something fragile in this arrangement, because when memory becomes habit, and habit loses meaning, all it takes is time for the entire edifice to vanish. Still, that's not inevitable. And here's why. The spiritual vacuum left by Christianity's decline hasn't remained empty. It's being filled by movements, ideologies, even algorithms. In the absence of transcendent values, politics has become moralized. Technology, worshipped. Identity, weaponized. But these replacements lack one crucial thing: forgiveness. They demand purity, performance, and allegiance, but offer no grace. And without grace, a society cannot sustain itself for long. This is why Eastern Europe matters. In places like Poland, Serbia, and Georgia, Christianity remains resilient, not despite hardship, but because of it. Where faith was once persecuted, it became precious. Where the state tried to erase belief, it only drove it deeper underground. And now, in a Europe that has grown uncertain of its own meaning, these countries offer a mirror, an uncomfortable one, because it suggests that maybe faith doesn't die in darkness. Maybe it only sleeps. So, what happens next? One path leads to a Christianity transformed into folklore, celebrated in architecture and holidays, but no longer believed. Another path leads to resurgence, born not from power, but from humility. And then there's the third path, the one we rarely speak of, the quiet replacement of Christianity by forces that look moral, sound righteous, but lack soul. We'll end with that question, because it might be the most important of all. If Europe loses its last link to the sacred, what will rise to replace it? What Europe did to Christianity was not an execution. It was erosion, a slow, cultural dismembering of something once central, until only a silhouette remained. And now, the West stands at a peculiar crossroads. It is materially rich, intellectually advanced, globally connected, and spiritually empty. The question isn't whether Europe will return to Christianity. That's too simplistic. The deeper issue is this: what happens to a civilization that forgets the very framework it was built on? Can laws stand without moral memory? Can communities thrive without shared rituals? Can identity survive without meaning? Pope Benedict XVI once predicted that the Church of the future would be smaller, less powerful, more honest, stripped of privilege, but purified by suffering. Perhaps that is already happening. And perhaps, paradoxically, that kind of faith might endure not in parliaments or public squares, but in living rooms, basements, or crumbling cathedrals still warmed by candlelight. If you've watched this far, you already sense it. This is not just a story about religion. It's about power, memory, and the invisible structures that hold a society together. What replaces faith is never neutral. And the future of the West may depend not on what it builds next, but on what it remembers not to destroy. Because, in the end, civilization is not just walls, wealth, or science. It is soul. And when a civilization loses its soul, even its victories begin to feel like defeat. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think deeper about where we've come from and where we might be going, then now is the time to stay connected. Subscribe to the channel. Leave a like if this gave you a new perspective. And most importantly, share this video with someone who still believes that history matters. Because it does. Here, we don't just talk about politics or religion, we talk about what holds a life together. Vision, discipline, courage, love, and the mindset that shapes your future. This channel exists to help you see clearly in a world full of noise, to remind you that no matter how chaotic things get, you are not powerless. The West may be changing, traditions may be fading, but new foundations can still be built, stronger, wiser, more human. And those who understand the past will shape what comes next. The future isn't written, but with clarity, with conviction, and with community, we can make sure it bends towards something worth believing in. Stay with us, because this journey is just beginning.